Welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for. I'm Christoph van Tomme, and together with my co-host Mark Bergauer and our guests, we explore how deliberate complexity, social practice theory, and a deeper understanding of socio-technical systems can transform our organizations and the world we live in.
Hi, I'm Mark Bergauer. Welcome to the 5th episode in the Deliberate Complexity series. We continue with our conversation with Professor Alicia Juarrero, a leading complexity theory philosopher and academic, as well as the founder and president of VectorAnalytica, a technology company that specializes in large-scale scientific data capture and real-time analysis tools. Alicia's work in complexity theory is widely quoted by thought leaders in the technology space and referenced in many recent complexity-informed approaches for managing highly dynamic systems as well as in knowledge management. Last week, we talked about how complex systems are path and history dependent and how boundaries of complex systems can inform how we should think about APIs. Today, we go deeper on enabling constraints, specifically catalysts, feedback loops, emergence, what this means for management, and why in complexity you need to start with your context. So you talked about enabling constraints, that you need catalysts and feedback loops and to make them work, etc. And there's one of my issues currently in the IT space. Enabling constraints has started to appear, especially in lean agile circles, but it's often misunderstood. So could you explain a little bit, maybe ideally in connection with membranes, because that's relevant to API folks, how can we use catalysts and feedback loops to make enabling constraints happen?
I think the catalysts and the feedback loops are the enabling constraints. They themselves are the enabling constraints. And the reason I use the word constraint is because a catalyst in biochemistry is conserved. It does not transfer energy. It creates the conditions that allow energy to flow more easily and therefore accelerates a particular reaction. I have to find a paper I wrote decades ago about managers as catalysts. I think that one basis of management from a complexity perspective is precisely to serve as a catalyst, as the agent of conditions that facilitate flow of information and energy and resources in the direction that the board has decided it wants the company to go. So it's almost like bulldozing the terrain. You know, you're not pushing the entity, but if you create a slope by providing more resources, then water will naturally flow in that direction, if you will. So I think acting as a catalyst, I've learned from Mark and his friends at Lean Agile that shorter feedback loops is important, because the shorter the feedback loop, the more embedded you are in the context. The longer the loop takes to complete, the farther away you are from the output that you want information back on. So shorter feedback loops. One thing we know about complex systems, and that's back to the stochasts and the Cartesian fish schools, is that the more variety of components, and more variety does not mean more of them, does not mean numerically. It means literally different types of components. You know, that helps with the flexibility that helps with the facilitation of the potential for a new emergence. So you can't force a new emergence. You can't push a new emergence. You can create the conditions that make it happen. And that's all I'm calling enabling constraints, conditions that lower barriers to energy flow in the direction you want it, or maybe raise barriers to energy flow in the directions you don't want it, or that you think will create an emergent property. You may be wrong, but that's what I think an enabling constraint does. I have a friend who taught for many years at the Naval Academy, Bob Artigiani, and he has a beautiful example of Admiral Nelson and how he beat Napoleon at Waterloo. And one of the things was he created a sense of camaraderie among the officer corps by literally having lunch with them often, or breaking meals, having dinner. So it got to the point that the feedback loop was so tight between that officer corps, they could almost know what the others were thinking. And so that's sort of an information channel that was created that enabled a distributed form of control, which is another characteristic of many complex systems. It enabled that distributed control to be coherent enough but sloppy enough so that when something unexpected happened in the battlefield at Waterloo, was about anyway, the individual officers on the individual ships could take the initiative and maneuver to find a new path to achieve that coherent purpose that they knew about, and they were always striving for. I don't know if that's a good example, but it's as good as any that I can think of.
I think one of the discussions I've had with Mark, something that he said that really piqued my interest was that this idea of managers as enabling constraints is fascinating, because that means this should be the purpose of a good manager. But the danger with having that in people is that there's often managers that are not necessarily using the power that they're deriving from that position in the system to support the system, but sometimes they'll divert too much energy towards themselves. And so one of the things I'm fascinated with is how organizations, so in the past, the most powerful enabling constraints we had in organizations, or some of the most powerful enabling constraints we had, were managers. But maybe there's new forms of enabling constraints that we can create now in organizations using technology. And that, I'm not sure if they're always, they don't necessarily want to divert energy towards themselves, although maybe they do. Yeah.
I'll make a philosophical distinction. In political philosophy, there's a distinction between power and authority. Mm-hmm. Power is raw power. Mm-hmm. That's almost Newtonian, and that's almost like pushing someone. Authority in political philosophy is rightful use of power. So there's a normative, there's a value component to authority. Yeah. And I would say that the manager that is misusing the power probably very quickly loses authority. In other words, people may think they have no choice but to follow him, but they don't respect him, and so on and so forth. I think some of the value of these evaluating feedback of and Amazon and so on, the consumer evaluation is a diversion of authority from the officialdom to perhaps the actual consumers of that product. And if you've got 97,000 who say this is a good, give it 4 stars, you assume that's kind of hard to finagle as a fake. If you've got 4 people, then it's the 4 cousins of the person who's selling that product. But if not, then that makes it a huge. Then Amazon had better not recommend a product that they have a vested interest in because it's one of their Amazon basics or whatever, if it's an inferior product, because they will quickly be exposed. That assumes, however, that the channel of information remains open and available. And part of the problem with the algorithms is that as it iterates, the more strident ones tend to go to the top rather than the more responsible but less strident. And so the problem starts turning into the stridency of the advocacy or the I mean, I think companies have always had this problem. There's always a mousy person who sits in the corner that nobody ever pays attention to, but is really someone who really knows the business, gets things done, and so on. And we've never been quite able to manage that problem. and the flashy, self-promoting person tends to get the promotion to begin with. And so that it starts, how did that person get to be the manager to begin with? And it's hard, what kind of feedback loops could be instituted to highlight and emphasize authoritarian voices. And I don't mean authoritarian in the dictatorship. I mean, as in someone speaks with authority, speaks with gravitas, or knows what they're talking about kind of authority.
That is a core problem that we start to articulate in management. So the way I make the distinction in management is in general, there's always this talk about leadership, but it ignores the fact that there is leadership. So Edgar Schein, articulates this, I think, in Humble Inquiry, but it could be elsewhere, that leadership is contextual and emerges from a situation versus following also your political philosophy distinction, authority, which is imbued to the person through the structure of the system. So they have a position and because they're in this position within the organization, they have authority to make decisions. And popular business advice or so is all about the characteristics or the charisma, we could say, of the leader. And it ignores that actually executing authority as given through your position is a completely different set of skills. So having charisma and in inspiring people to do certain things is one set of skills. Actually being able to make the decisions that you are appointed to make because of your position in the network is a completely different set of skills. We don't distinguish one for the other, especially because if you want to sell yourself as a consultant or courses, etc., it's much easier to serve the ego of people and say, hey, you have leadership characteristics and charisma and we'll teach you, or even if you lack it, we can teach you how to have it, because we all want to be like influential just by our personality. And there seems to be very little appetite of actually really doing the hard work of starting to understand what are the skills that are attached to executing authority. This is also why I'm still deeply skeptical that technology is yet anywhere suitable to be employed instead of managers, because so this is something we might get at some point too, but practice theory has taught us that actually any kind of material tool is a form of materialized practice.
Right. Yeah.
Which means before we can create a material form or a IT form of management, we actually have to fully understand what these competences are that an authoritative position attaches.
Right.
And since we don't, I don't think management can be automated yet. And the danger of automating the leadership thing is that it removes the context, because that's the other weakness of automation, is that it actually it's not capable of adapting to changes in the context. Automation only works as long as the context stays the same.
Remains the same. Correct. That's what human beings presumably are good at, noticing patterns that might have changed somewhat.
Hopefully.
Sometimes.
Social systems per se are, I believe they have evolved because they have higher adaptability to changes in context. So,
correct.
So you would expect that also a healthy social system, which is a workforce with managers, experts, etc. Or a sign of a healthy workforce is that they notice and are able to reflect on changes in context. Whereas so that's one of my signs. An unhealthy workforce is sort of still following some idealized version of the context that some leader, mostly a exec or so, has put out, and never questions whether that vision or that view of reality is actually still applicable, or where the reality actually has changed.
I think the attraction of that idealized notion is part of the baggage we have inherited from the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, that there are ideal prescriptions that apply everywhere at all times and at all places, and these are eternal verities. And part of that comes from the idea that I think we think human beings have a nature, that's just human nature. So that's an unchanging, eternal, essential trait. And so there's no need to worry about context, because nature will always let out. And so I think the more we start emphasizing the role of context in literally changing the entities caught up in that context, I think, and I think young people are so into ecology that maybe there's some hope that appreciation of ecological problems, which are all contextual, will translate into an appreciation for context elsewhere in business, in society, in family relations, so on.
You would almost say, I was just thinking that maybe complexity should really be called contextity.
Yeah, I like that.
Because
it's many variables interacting, becoming interdependent, and that interdependence becomes a context that each of these responds to and is caught up in, it seems to me. I can't teach this without doing this. I don't know how to do it otherwise, but in this way.
You're weaving your fingers together for the listeners. Yeah. So I think that we had a question prepared around tools, and because in the IT world, we're really in love with tools, and there's this idea, like, you get a mission, you need to buy a tool to do XYZ, and the analyst says, like, well, this is the category, these are the best tools, go out and buy the best tool, buy the best of breed. But in a complexity, that doesn't make necessarily sense. What would what are the things that people should pay attention to cater to the interdependencies of systems? Like, where would you get? So, if you would send somebody off, go buy me a tool to do X, Y, Z. How would you structure that to make sure that they're not just blindly buying the best tool based on somebody's opinion?
I think before I told them go buy this tool, I'd say, show me what you're going to use it for. Show me what the conditions are. Show me what you can and cannot do with those tools, how much you can afford to pay or not. In other words, show me the context first. Mm-hmm. And then you fit the tool to the context rather than trying to define the context abstractly, which is sort of another kind of idealization. And so I think fittingness of tool to purpose is probably the more important of the issues involved.
And I think a really important aspect then is also what are the competencies that your team has?
Yeah, that's true too.
And how are they going? Yeah. And how are they going to be interacting with those? We see this. We've seen this sometimes with our customers also that are like, okay, so we've bought an API management solution. Now we need a developer portal. This is the thing that we sell. But then when you start asking, like, so do you have any technical writing happening? And like, no, we don't have any of that. And then, and it's really quickly that it appears that, well, but you will not be successful if you don't do these things. And yeah, I think that's really important. It's tools are not enough. They're just a start. Yeah.
We had that problem. You asked me earlier about the technology side of what I do. And we knew, for example, that in order to stop vector-borne diseases like mosquito-borne diseases like dengue or Zika or malaria and so on, those really get contained locally. Because those are the folks who need to find out, oh, we've got a small outbreak here and we can contain it right here, stop it right here, and it will prevent it from becoming epidemic. But the problem is there's a contradiction because those very local context-dependent conditions, the folks in a little county in rural Texas or Alabama in the United States, or use the example you wish elsewhere in the world, they don't have the statistical skills to add statistical packages to the software, or they don't have mapping skills to add to the software. So it all has to be made. They have to be empowered to be able to use the tool through good design, and I guess that's why people like Jabe would come into the picture. Good design would be, what is the lowest level of skill set that would allow this tool to be used? And the way we started thinking about it was, well, most folks, even in rural conditions nowadays, can use a smartphone. Mm-hmm. And so they know how to click and press, and they know how to, so that's about the level. But don't ask for somebody to do the statistical software. But the converse of that is those folks don't have the resources to purchase your tool that has all those capabilities. So it's a very difficult balancing act, because the CDC and NIH and all these folks who deal with the World Health Organization, they're dealing with things at the 30,000 foot level. But a lot of their recommendations and a lot of their suggestions have to get implemented at the really, really local level. And those folks can't adapt those tools. And I think I'm trying to give an example that's similar to yours. They can't adapt those tools to be used at this local level. Very difficult for them.
And this connects also to one thing that I I think I was listening to another podcast that had you as a guest. Where one of the stories that fascinated me was that your company, VectorAnalytica, you were in a competition against like really well-funded companies that had spent lots and lots of money to build like amazing machines to do to basically to analyze where a next pandemic would hit or where there would be problems with vector-borne diseases. And that actually in the competition, you came out actually with a system that was not as heavyweight.
Correct. And I think, again, this had to do with my exposure to the Cuban situation. One of the folks in that competition was representing a CDC outpost in Iquitos, Peru, at the source of the Amazon. No, there are not that many supercomputers in Iquitos, Peru.
Yes.
Zero, right? And it does no good to tell them, look, we're going to run this model. It takes 2 weeks to run. That has all the bells and whistles in the world, but 2 weeks later, mosquitoes don't even live for 2 weeks. So by the time the computer came back, the data sources were not there anymore. And so we understood that this needed, maybe it doesn't have to be as precise as the supercomputer would get it, but it's got to be good enough to solve the problem for the person on the ground right now. That's what's more important. And it was just a shock to me that anybody at those universities would even try. I mean, because really what they had in mind was, I'm going to publish a paper. Not I'm going to solve this guy's problem or this person's problem. Here's another example. The State Department invited me to go to a tech camp in Bogota where they were really trying to help empower people with technology and throughout all of Latin America. Well, I took advantage of, I was in Bogota to go visit and I'll mention the name, the Instituto Santa Fe in Bogota, which is a very, very respectable epidemiological research center in Bogota. And they told me that they had an experience, and here I won't give you the name, of the same thing. A fancy, very, very powerful, very respectable and well-known university in the United States that had given them this fabulous software tool for them to do what my company, VectorAnalytica, was supposed to do, which is monitor and track the presence of vectors, be it mosquitoes or ticks or whatever. Yeah, but you know what? As soon as that software left on a cell phone out in the jungle, no connectivity, the thing wouldn't work. Excuse me? American developer never thought that there might be a situation where there was no connectivity. So that's the context dependence and the context awareness that I think complexity forces you to be aware of. And so we said, oh, no, ours is great because all you do is you download the map of where you're going while you're still in the office, and then you go out there and you still have all the trails and you still have all the detail, and you can upload data and save it on the phone, and then when you get back, then you can upload it to the cloud service, no problem. And why would a university? They gave them this. In fact, I don't remember if they gave them the software or they charged them for them. I can't, but they might have even charged them for it, or they charged the State Department to give them or USAID to get. And it's like a brick. They could use it for nothing. It was that's an example.
So the previous example was an example of complexity and how understanding complexity can also help in business context. Do you have other examples of applying complexity that helped you to run a better business? Because you're also you're not only a philosopher, you're also a business leader.
I'm not sure it's really that efficient a business. It started more as a project among a bunch of academics, and it ended up as a business. But I'll give you an example, and that is the whole notion of managers as catalysts was a big learning tool there, because these are all professionals and they all know what they're doing. And so thinking you can tell people what to do it was easy to learn. But also, for example, since these folks are developers and they're writing software, and it was being funded initially by family and friends, the idea of spending time and money and resources to document with the documentation of the software. I quickly learned that is very important. And for a whole bunch of reasons, because if that particular developer leaves, and it's a form of maintaining a distributed form of control and transparency that I learned to my chagrin. I should have known that a little bit better. And one more example, and that was throughout Latin America, I was told, oh, but we have records of mosquitoes and clinical cases of dengue, for example, going back to the beginning of the 20th century. But they're we finally, with a lot of trouble, transferred them into Excel files. Isn't there anything you can do about it? Well, if you're going to have a cell phone that can work in the Amazon, you might as well then integrate another database, and that is all the information you have from those Excel archival data. So you're taking the temporal context into account, and if nothing else, it gives you a Bayesian prior baseline on which to then look and see whether the new data you're getting is completely different or why or not, or it gives you a sense of a historical trajectory in a particular location. So that was useful to us as well.
You said something interesting about documentation. Would you, because, documentation and APIs is super important.
I learned.
Would you say that documentation is an enabling constraint?
No, I think I'd say initially it's a governing or constituent constraint, because once it's documented, then those are the constraints that hold the software together, right? Those are the the characteristics that it stabilizes that constraint. But that said, it enables the next step. In a sense, it enables the next stage. Once you know how much this can give you and get you, I would say that it would show me if this software was built in a way that I could add on to it and grow it, or if it stabilizes it in a way that it really freezes it. And so that's exactly what you don't want, because you don't want it to be so stable that, again, it becomes the perfect fitness. Yeah. And so it has no evolvability. It cannot then handle a new situation. That's why, for example, we tried to do and we were very pleased when we did our software. We had up to chikungunya, with dengue and then chikungunya, but all of a sudden Zika. Remember the horrible stories years ago with the children with the horrible situation. You want to make sure you can incorporate new fields, new databases, new variables, and for that, APIs have been a godsend. Another thing that we were able to use APIs with, that we were able to bring in, was census data. The entire census data of the United States going back forever is available now with an API you can just plug into your system. And it's unbelievable how that gives you information about, for example, one thing we learned, we were doing some work about presence of rats and rodents in Minneapolis. And it was amazing that it correlated very nicely with the age of the physical structure of the area. Meaning, if you had very old brick buildings, the mortar between the buildings crumbled. And that's the way the rats were getting into the building. So, and we only were able to see that once we superimposed the API of the census data with the API of the reports of rodent infestation, whoops, it all of a sudden, see, that's what I mean by those are emergent characteristics. The combination ends up being more than the sum of the two separately. And that was very useful to us.
just to reiterate on this point, that documentation is initially, at least, a governing constraint, because, okay, your experience might be different and more relevant, but my experience in the past was also, as soon as you start introducing documentation to your software, developers also are aware, we've now written down these rules that the software adheres to. So how they change the software becomes a bit more constrained so you have the documentation, you don't want to go and have to change it. So you're making sure that whatever you change it to still adheres to the rules. So it has a real stabilizing effect. But then so the interesting point is having actually documented software that is stabilizing then allows higher order systems to start building upon. So this is a core principle of complexity, that once you stabilize interaction at a certain level, then that enables, in a sense, new interactions to happen at a higher order system. That's exactly what you want with APIs.
And I think that's the one of the mind bends for me was that an API actually is really a contract. It's an evolving contract between two parties, that if I'm going to send you a request in this format, you're going to send me information in this format. And it is also an adaptation dance. Like the most successful API programs that I've heard, they are actually listening to their consumers. Like, imagine that. but actually, this is kind of novel. There's a lot of teams that just build stuff, but really good APIs, they're basically creating this collaborative designed documentation about how they're going to interact with each other. That's basically the whole thing, which is super, super fascinating.
Well, and it applies to the title of your podcast, API resilience. It's not just API stability. Mm-hmm. Resilience meaning it can evolve. It doesn't just adapt to the current conditions, but it can evolve if things change in the future or the conditions, the context changes completely in the future. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. The dynamics in action is it's kind of like this insider secret sauce, like where and I hear more and more, I hear people talking about it. And also, like when I was I just did a course with Ruth Mellon from the Bredemeyer Institute. And so now I was talking about constraints, and like, oh, you mean like in Alicia Juarrero's book, Dynamics in Action, is like, yeah, actually, yes. So,
that's very nice.
Can you give me a little bit of well, we've talked about some of it, but is there something that you want to highlight still out of that book?
No, I think what I was trying to do was use this notion of complex systems and particular causation in explaining intentional action, which philosophers have used mechanical models to explain forever, and they continue to do that. What I'm trying to do in the next book that I'm calling Context Changes Everything is to expand that notion of constraint to include examples like I gave, like I use the prairie grassland exhibit, I use lasers, I use the homeostasis. There are examples about atmospheric dynamics in the earth that seem to have remained stable for eons, even before oxygen and human. So it cannot be natural selection only because there was no life back then when, and yet there are certain levels of study. So the question is, are there forms of dynamic equilibrium that cross the abiotic, non-living to the biotic living realm, and then hopefully to the psychological and sociological, cultural aspects that one can find analogies? I'm not saying exactly the same pattern, but similarities in the way enabling constraints put together new coherence, which then became stabilized, which became then the basis on which novel forms of constraints built the next level such as chemistry from physics and then biology and so on. That's what I'm trying to do. I worry that I might bite off way more than I can chew because my background is philosophy and my knowledge of science is very, very weak.
But as for storytelling, you don't necessarily need to have the hard details. It's more. I've talked about this with Mark, that it's kind of like, it feels like the universe is a fractal of. It's like a fractal model. So like whenever you zoom in somewhere and there's the same kind of things, it's slightly different, but it's the same kind of models that you see interacting and playing out new things.
And maybe especially the same types of constraints, like some constraints that take a system away from equilibrium, like gradients. Mm-hmm. Like fields that take systems away from equiprobability. Those are, a gradient makes a state space improbable. Everything's not equally probable throughout the space.
Yeah.
And then what I call context-dependent constraints, of which enabling constraints are one variety. And those are the ones that link together and make one conditionally probable on another. So they all of a sudden get linked probabilistically. So given that this has happened, this is more likely to happen, or given that this is the case, this won't happen at all. Those are context-dependent constraints that then start creating a rugged landscape, meaning what some things become more probable in these boundaries, other things become less probable in these boundaries. So I've tried to apply that throughout the cosmos, from the abiotic through living things into the social system, at least to suggest that this is one way of looking at things.
So I've been thinking in this direction, like with like currency systems. So there's biological currency systems with ATP and ADP. We have currency in our society now. So there's like, how are so you see these things coming back like within different places, and is that also something you're looking at? Or
well, I would say that that currency is a channel that facilitates flows of energy, stocks, information, correct? And so we use the word currency metaphorically to talk about channels of information, correct? But we also use it to talk about channels of energy, be it chemical energy or electrical energy, current, or biological, metabolic energy, correct? So I think currencies are forms of enabling constraints, right? They also store value, they store constraints, which is also interesting. I woke up this morning and opened the paper and said, every currency in the world has gone down yesterday except for the US dollar. So then that must have something to do with the Fed decision yesterday to raise interest rates.
Yes.
So it's contextual. It's not that there's anything magical about it's that it's tied to the decision of the federal. So it's conditional upon the situation with the Federal Reserve at the moment, right? So yeah, absolutely. I think currencies are a beautiful example of flows of energy, channeled flows. Moreno and Mosio give us a very good example of a governing constraint, the human vasculature system, the lymph nodes or the blood flow. They do not transfer energy at all. The actual vessels, the veins and the arteries do not transfer, do not push. They're not the heart. It is a pump that pushes like the cue stick would push the cue ball. They are the channels that organize and channel and make it easier for energy to flow blood, lymph, in an aligned fashion. Otherwise, it would dissipate in a very disorganized way throughout the system. Yet sometimes when you get to the alveoli in the lungs, you know, you need that dissipation, or the capillaries. The channels themselves are not enough to fill in the state space the way you need it to.
Do you think there's like a vocabulary of model patterns that's universal?
Andre Bejan thinks that. He thinks that there are patterns of energy flow, and he gives an example like river basins, exactly, in the vasculature system. If you look at lightning strikes, it kind of looks similar. You've got the first channel, then it sort of spreads out. And so apparently those patterns maximize energy flow and fill in or exploit the state space better than without the pattern.
But it feels that there's like certain like constructors for models that nature is reusing and recombining in different ways, and that like sets of constraints, or always in a different incarnation. But like for example, the currency system in mitochondria. Like how and it's amazing. It's just mind-boggling, and I'm wondering if there's like, if we could define that language of models of complexity or patterns of complexity, if we would be able to like have like a different vocabulary to do business with, also, where we can say like, I can use this here and so on. Yeah.
I worry sometimes as a philosopher that I will be seen by physicists and hard scientists as, at this point the philosopher went nuts. I suspect that if there are such patterns, it has to all bottom out in thermodynamics. That they all have to be compatible with and satisfying the second law of thermodynamics, at the very least. So whether it is ATP energy flow or electrical or bio or nutrients or whatever, the pattern must facilitate energy flow better than not having that pattern. Yeah. And some patterns may be better than others at facilitating energy flow. So over time, you get even abiotic selection of the more efficient, effective thermodynamic patterns throughout the cosmos, which is why you get spirals of galaxies, which is why you get, that sort of thing. I suspect, I have no idea.
So I just want to quickly put a foot in, because what you asked for was universal patterns and a sort of a pattern library. And I just want to remind you that this is still actually back to Aristotle types of philosophy. So I think what we get from Alicia's book is a language in which we can start articulating some of these concepts in a different way. But as her new book title says, context changes everything. If we want to get to the universal level, speak second law of thermodynamics, the explanatory power in our context will be banal, trivial, not very useful. So if we want to be useful, so also having some of that book, what is really interesting is how the language actually starts to allow us which contexts can we compare. So absolutely can we learn from different domains about what might be suitable for new domains that we're exploring, but only in terms of where we're capable of saying what are the commonalities between these contexts. And what we totally need to get away from is finding this single answer, like the one law that underlies the the physics of the universe, etc. Because I think that has been the fallacy of physics, that it said in the end we need to find a single law. We might one day find it, but it won't explain it will not help us with any of our current problems. It will not help us inventing new things that are good for everybody, etc. So get away from universal patterns.
That's why I call for effective science. Instead of in philosophy and in natural science, if it isn't underwritten by universal laws, it isn't considered science, which is why for so many natural scientists, they consider the social sciences, psychology, economics, non-sciences, because they are not underwritten by universal laws. But I think it was Herbert Simon who also called for effective laws, and that is laws within this context. And so then the question is, what kind of laws might apply given this context? And then the next step, as Mark says, would be the comparison between contexts and what might fall under this general context that we might not think about before. For example, human beings are dissipative structures in the same way that a tornado and a hurricane is a dissipative structure. Who would have put those three entities in the same category? Well, because we found a context in which certain conditions, far from equilibrium, context-dependent constraints, self-organized boundary conditions. And but if you specify the detail, the devil's in the detail, where you specify the details of the context, then some very interesting anomalies or novelties might pop up that you hadn't expected before.
And it's this, it's the human condition, the need to categorize things. Mm-hmm. I think because that's how we think, or at least I think that's how we think. But
I would again disagree. So, Kahneman has actually already explained to us that there's two ways we think, at least. Although I just think these are extremes of a spectrum, of a gradient. But categorization helps us save energy when we're trying to think. Right. Yeah? Yeah. But we're quite capable sometimes to think about things without,
of course,
falling into categories.
But it's this looking for. It's this fascination with, I recognize this, or you're in a completely different scale of the universe, and suddenly you're like, oh, this is just like this other thing that I saw very, very differently. It's different. It's not the same. It really is fractal. It's contextualized and it's doing slightly different things, but still it's familiar with something else that you've seen at another scale. And this is so wondrous, I feel, and I think that's also where there's a lot of inspiration for everybody of us, like no matter what domain you're exploring and you're looking for, I believe. And that's what fascinates me in complexity is can I look at a biological system and can I use whatever I've learned there as inspiration to find something new in a business system? Can I look at physics and well, maybe not physics, but you know what?
Even physics.
Even physics. Yeah, that's. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Catherine Hales, who wrote a book on metaphors, compares a metaphor to an old-fashioned compass. And I really like that metaphor for metaphor. She says one leg of the compass is fixed, but the other one is allowed to roam free. And I really like that view of how we think of metaphor, because metaphor is not totally unmoored.
Yes.
There is one leg of a metaphor that probably is grounded in something that remains the same, and the other one is allowed to roam free.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
This was fun. This was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Good point to end, yes. On a metaphor.
Meta.
I think that's a perfect place to
Thank
wrap
you
it
so
up.
much. This was really enjoyable. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's it for our interview with Alicia Juarrero. You can learn more about Alicia's company at VectorAnalytica.com. That's VectorAnalytica in one word. This podcast was brought to you by Pronovix and Contextualize. You can learn more about our companies at pronovix.com and maturitymapping.com. Thank you for listening, and until next week, please mind your context.